Welcome to those of you joining. We'll get started here in just a little bit. All right, looks like we got people entering the auditorium now. Just a few more seconds before we get started. Thanks everybody for joining. I think we'll get started now. It's my pleasure to introduce Nick Rinalon from Citrix Consulting. He's a principal architect and senior director. Nick's been working with Login VSI for a very long time. We've been partnering on a lot of stuff. If you've caught any of Nick's webinars or technical content in the past, you know that his content is just outstanding, and from a technical perspective, has really helped just a ton of customers in his career. Nick, we definitely want to thank Citrix for sponsoring us, and I want to hand the mic over to you. And for the next 45 minutes, Nick, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Blair, for that introduction. Definitely excited to be doing this today. Ever since I think we did the event in Amsterdam, I've been looking forward to doing this one here in the U.S. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. As Blair said, I'm Nick Rinalon. I've been with CCS for the last 15 years, actually. And some of my favorite projects kind of when I was coming up in the field were scalability testing or load testing projects. And I've used, I think, all the tools out there, but lately, for the last probably 5 to 10 years, been using Login VSI. So I'm going to cover the top 10 or more, I think it says in the official title, performance best practices. And these kind of, go across the board in terms of VDI, server-based computing or RDSH, and cloud. So I've sprinkled in a few best practices from each of the different areas. So with that, we'll get started. And basically what I'm going to do is a little top 10 countdown. So we'll start kind of with 10 and we'll work our way down to the number 1. And then at the end, I'll kind of provide some ways to check your work, in terms of how do you size servers or what kind of density you might expect. I'll provide a few different ways or methods to do that. And if there's time, we'll take some questions. So feel free to ask those in the Q&A pane. And if we don't have enough time to get to the questions at the end, we'll try to follow up in some capacity after the webinar. On the right there, you see a picture. You might have already seen this in one of the earlier sessions, but I think this is a good way to think about all the different areas where you can do tuning, right, to VDI or SBC. And then I've added some arrows to a few of these that roughly align with those. Those are some of the topics that I'm going to cover today. So when you see the 10 or 12 things I have, they kind of align to those different areas in the VDI Tuning Stack. And then one quick disclaimer before I start off the top 10. So, there's the word performance in the title here, and that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, I think if you're an end user, that definitely means, like the in-session user experience, and that's, absolutely important. But, maybe if you're an IT admin or an architect or consultant, it can mean server scalability, or triple S, single server scalability. And so I am going to talk about that, I think, the most today. I mean, when I looked at the top 10 or 12 things I put together, the most have to do with, density and how to size and optimize server or sort of back-end performance. But I did also sprinkle in a couple things to talk about, the user experience and in-session performance and login times, for example. Because those, when you add it all up, performance means all those things, right? So anyways, just wanted to kind of throw that out there. All right, number 10. So the first kind of best practice or leading practice is something I call deuces are wild. So, this is in the context of RDSH or server-based computing or Zen app, virtual apps, whatever you want to call it. But one of the things you have to nail is this CPU over subscription ratio. So I often get asked, should we be overcommitting any CPU or any cores, or should we overcommit, 50% of that, right? Is it 1.5x, which kind of used to be the best practice, or is there another magic number, And so the magic number that I'm saying these days is 2x, and which effectively means I like to oversubscribe or double the number of physical cores. So I give an example there, which might help. But if you have a kind of a 2 by 16, right? So you have 16 cores in each of those sockets. So that's 32 physical cores. I'm basically saying times that by 2 is 64, and 64 is really the magic number you want to use. So I might recommend a configuration there like 8 VMs, with 8 vCPUs each. And so that 8 by 8, and you get, when you do that multiplication, it equals 64. That's what the 2x is I'm talking about. And again, I'm really focused on CPU here because 9 times out of 10, when you're dealing with VDI or server-based computing, CPU is the bottleneck. So that's why a lot of this stuff and some of the magic rules and multipliers I'll talk about later on, they all have to do with really CPU, and that's why. I'm not saying that CPU's always the bottleneck. I mean, I've run into plenty of applications or workloads that might be memory bound, for example. Occasionally we still have a storage bottleneck, but I'm just saying 9 out of 10 times it's CPU. And so that's the CPU over subscription ratio. So some people ask, well, why? Like, why? How do we get away with 2x? Isn't that dangerous? Yeah, maybe, but here's why. So hyperthreading, which is, this is an interesting topic because we now have mitigations like L1 terminal fault, for example, and some of these things are actually, changing the way hyperthreading works or disabling hyperthreading altogether. But anyways, let's say hyperthreading is still available. That's still going to give you kind of 20 to 30%. And I think we've proved that over the last decade or so that it's somewhere in that range. And also hardware improvements. I mean, every single, time Intel, AMD ships a server, it gets better. And also the hypervisors, right? So every time, Citrix Zen Server, VMware, or, Nutanix, whatever it might be, every time we ship a new version of a hypervisor, the CPU scheduler is improved and it's more efficient. It can do more basically with less. And then the other big one that I always point out is the activity ratio. So that the ratio of kind of doing real work, right, being active versus idle time, it's a lot lower in the real world. And some of the, even login VSI, right, like they're a lot, some of their default, workloads, they might be active 80, 85% of the time. And I think that's a little too high. So it's very conservative, which is great, but at the same time, it can, it might result in you, not oversubscribing the optimal amount of CPU for a real world workload. And so that's what I mean by that. I always provide one example is the largest Zen app customer, virtual apps customer in the world. I kind of surveyed them and they have a couple 100,000 users and their activity ratio was right around 40%. And so again, if you used an activity ratio of 85%, that can really skew your numbers. And in those scenarios where it maybe is 80% activity ratio, yeah, then maybe that's where you dial it down from 2x to maybe 1.75 or 1.5. But anyways, as a rule of thumb, 2x, I like that. That's the way to go. Number 9, go big or go home. So one of the questions I get a lot too, when sizing is, do I scale up or do I scale out? And it depends. But these days, and I think, 10 years ago, as I said here, it was like 2 vCPUs or 4 vCPUs. That was the leading practice. And that's what everybody did. Everywhere I went, it was like everyone's using 2 or 4 vCPU specs. But these days, I mean, there's been a lot of advancements. And so that's definitely no longer the case. I'm a big fan of scaling up as long as you get or achieve linear scalability. So, if you have a good understanding of the NUMA nodes or the microprocessor configuration, then I think you can size your Zen app VMs appropriately and scale up as high as you can without crossing that NUMA boundary or or cluster. That's what it's all about, is scaling up as high as you go. Because if you go over that, like let's say you cross a NUMA node, that can lead to NUMA thrashing, and then you basically get nonlinear scalability. So it's kind of one of those it depends things, is where you stop in terms of scaling up. But I like to scale up as high as you can go, as long as you're achieving linear scalability. You know, less VMs to manage, and again, you're getting that good performance. And then the other thing too, we get asked is like, you know, why do everyone settle on 4 vCPUs or 8 vCPUs? You know, can you go odd? Absolutely. You know, almost all of our healthcare deployments, you know, at least 5 years ago, were using 3 vCPU XenApp VMs. So, and we do 5 and 7, as I'm saying here, all the time. It really has to do with the number of, you know, physical cores in the box and how those cores are laid out. So again, understanding that, and I'll talk about this in a bit too, the Intel microprocessor architecture underneath. It's really key these days in sizing it and determining how to carve up your XenApp VMs on a host. Number 8, optimizations or tuning, you know, definitely still very critical. You know, and I think every vendor out there has their own kind of white paper that documents, you know, what to tune and how to tune it and what to tweak. But one example I always like to show, just to show you how important this is and like how much money it can save you, is you know, I think it was a couple of years back, Login VSI demonstrated a 47% improvement to single server scalability by just taking OSOT and then a few more tweaks. There were like, I want to say 4 more tweaks on top of it. That was all they did. And they were basically, you know, like the baseline was 100, you know, Win 10 VMs per host. And with this simple tweak, just with, you know, running the optimizer, you know, they were getting 147, right? Or 150, as I say there. So a huge, huge savings there. And then, you know, on our side, you know, Martin Z, who's actually going to be talking a bit later, I believe, you know, he's kind of the brains behind Citrix Optimizer. So, you know, that really should be your best friend, along with, you know, if you're a VMware shop, you know, their optimization tool. And then the other thing I always point out here is this BISIF, you know, thing they have at the bottom there. So Dennis Span, you know, one of our CTAs or CTPs, he's put together this really cool community tool. And this is, you can use this on top of Citrix Optimizer or OSOT. So this is really cool. It's sort of additive, like these things aren't mutually exclusive. And where this comes into play is all those third-party apps and agents that are, you know, we seem to have in our golden images almost every time. So things like Semantic Antivirus or whatever AV you have, AppSense, SCCM, you know, those are, there's basically optimizations for those third-party agents and tools inside BISIF. And so you can overlay that on top of Citrix Optimizer, which is cool, and get some additional savings. All right, number 7, ring versus mesh. And so this is what I was talking about with Intel and Focus here for a minute. But a lot of the older chips, you know, I'd say this is probably 3-4 years ago, we're using this ring-based architecture. And so there was big talk, I remember, on NUMA, and I wrote a lot of blogs on NUMA, and, you know, everyone's obsessed with NUMA. And that's great. And it really, this had to do with how Intel was constructing, or, you know, how they were physically constructing these chips. And as the number of cores increased, you know, as we went from 16 to 20 to, let's say, higher and higher, the access latency increased, and then the bandwidth per core was, you know, diminished. And so Intel would basically solve this problem by splitting the chip into 2 halves. And they would add a second ring to reduce the physical distances between these things. And so like an example there is, you know, if you have a 12-core box, let's say, or chip, and that might be split into 2 NUMA nodes with 6 cores each. And so we would say 6 vCPUs is optimal, again, to achieve linear scalability and sizing up or scaling up. That was the way to go. And that all had to do with, you know, the NUMA nodes. But these days, we're no longer using that ring-based architecture. It's a mesh. This is starting in the Skylake era. And so we don't have that, you know, that mitigation where we're splitting, you know, the chip into 2 halves. We don't have that anymore. And this really changes the way we size, you know, our, you know, for example, our RDSH servers. So an example, I just was at a customer and they had one of these newer 20-core gold chips. And you might think like, oh, we should go with 10 or maybe 5 or 8 vCPUs. No, because it's a mesh architecture, we can go higher. And we went with 16 vCPUs actually per XenApp VM. And we achieved linear scalability. So that's what I want to point out here. That might look weird or like a different kind of configuration or not optimal, but it was perfectly fine in terms of performance. And again, it has the added benefit of managing less VMs because we're scaling up. So that's an important thing I don't think a lot of people have quite caught on to yet. Number 6, so now I want to talk about a few ways that can really crush performance. And the first is ads. So advertising, and one of the things we always highlight these days is it's like, what's the most popular application out there using like VDI or, a Zen app environment? And it's the browser, right? So whether it's IE or Chrome these days or whatever, the browser is still the #1 app. And about 4 years, I think it was in 2015, Dan Allen and I presented on this topic at Bri Forum, and we were basically showing how just using Internet Explorer, Firefox, or whatever, if you just browse around to different websites like New York Times and CNN and the Register, that every time you open up one of those tabs, like you might be getting 10 ads on a page, and then also on the back end it might be reaching out to 30 different content delivery networks piping those ads in. And those can crush, not only are they security, kind of concern, let's say, but they can crush your performance and really CPU and memory, which are the bottlenecks, when it comes to our workloads. And so I think in that session, we showed, with Firefox, there was like a 33% hit, I want to say, to CPU. And again, since CPU is the bottleneck, that directly translated to 33% less users per box. So anyways, if you Google this, you can kind of grab that performance white paper in the top right corner there. It says like why web browsing was killing VDI performance and costing you big. But so anyways, how do you get around this? We were also showing live. I think we did a demo with the TPLs, so those tracking protection. It's kind of a new thing that, not a new thing, it's been around a while, but I think it was like IE9 it came out. But anyways, we were showing how TPLs, like a simple tracking protection list, and I've shown kind of one here, this easy list. That's one of the most popular tracking protection lists, and there's a bunch out there you can go download and try. But just something as simple as that, just eliminates a ton of those ads. It makes your browsing safer, as I said, maybe a nice added side benefit. And then there's other stuff out there too, right? Like AdBlock Plus, I know a lot of folks use, or uBlock Origin. And then there's also, those are both kind of browser-based, plugins. But then there's things that are DNS-based solutions, right? And pfSense is one of the most popular ones there. And I want to show you how significant, like something like PFS or something like pfSense DNS-based can actually save you. So check this out. The great guys over at ICT, they basically stacked up pfSense, which is the gray there. And then the orange, I don't know if you can read it, but it says browser-based. So that's actually AdBlock Plus, which is, I think, one of the most popular kind of browser-based approaches, right, for managing ads. And so they showed AdBlock Plus, maybe 8 or 10% right there. So still better than nothing. And blue is the baseline, right? And then the pfSense, though, 147%. So again, like, and I've seen like, if you have 10, 20 tabs open, I mean, it's per tab, and like, I've seen Chrome, for example, just chew up like 5 gigs per user. And a lot of it has to do with that. So if you do this, I mean, maybe you can slash off 30%, 47%, whatever it might be, even 10%, it all helps. And so this is something I see a lot of customers just forgetting to kind of do. So anyways, that can help a lot. Another killer, right, is all the different, kind of security management monitoring agents. I lump those all together. But, antivirus, I want to say, is probably the first and biggest one. I remember I actually published, I want to say 10 years ago, the Citrix antivirus article that has all the different kind of rules and exclusions that we laid out to make things, sort of, to provide the best balance between performance and security, which is really what it's all about. So if you want to see the latest and greatest, we actually just put those on TechZone in the last few months. So, there's a link right there to it. But it doesn't stop there with AV, right? I mean, I think all these things we're seeing now around, security and monitoring, I've listed a few of the popular ones there, like Tanium and FireEye, and now there's the DLP software, but they all take a toll. And so I think it's important for, architects to look at each one of those individually and see kind of what they're doing, number one. But number two, reach out to the vendor or go to their website, do some homework and figure out, do they also have like a recommended approach for, optimizing performance or providing a balance between performance and security in a virtualized environment? A lot of these things I think were developed with physical kind of endpoints in mind, but they might have special, considerations for, a virtualized environment, or whether it be VDI or SBC. So I just think, you got to do your homework there, because those can, I mean, leaving these things kind of default in our world can just crush performance. And I always get asked, like, how bad can AV be if I don't do these things? Yeah, I mean, I've seen everything, 50%, 75%. So anyways, the key is to kind of get that down, right, and have some decent performance, but still have some great security. That's what it's all about. So next up here, number 4, I'm saying consider the latest releases. And so, in our world, in the Citrix world, we have kind of the notion of current releases, which are kind of releases we ship every 3 quarters, or every 3 months or every quarter. And then we have these long-term service releases, right, that we ship typically every couple of years. But, I just wanted to show you, this is a slide from one of my colleagues, Dan Feller. This is looking at the CPU in a steady state, basically. And we're looking at Windows 10 here. And then we're also looking at, the different Citrix releases on the bottom. So you can see everything from 7.11 is the bar on the far left in the blue. And then you see LTSR is really that 7.15. It's a gray bar. It's kind of right in the middle. And on the far right is like our latest releases, right? So like 18.11 and 19.03, those are on the far right. And what you see here is basically the footprint of the VDA. It's gone down significantly. So there's a nice kind of savings there, about 40 or 50%, especially since the last LTSR. So anyways, that's kind of maybe a reason to go CR or get off the LTSR track, maybe. But there's more. So I wanted to, also important to look at the host side, and and so this was a study that the ICT guys did again, and I want to note that this is being updated because there was a little bit of an issue, I think, with the login VSI activity bar, what it was. So this, these results might change, but our internal tests at Citrix are still showing this same thing. And it might not be like 31% as you see here, but we're definitely seeing a savings in terms of single server scalability. Like I said, the host footprint, it's going down too. So LTSR is it's really the 2 on the left here, the blue and the orange. And then the latest releases, you see here in kind of the far right, 30 or 31% kind of savings. And when, like I said, this is going to, this particular study might change. It might go down to 20, 15, who knows, but we're seeing the same things in our internal testing. So hopefully they'll validate that soon. And then even VMware, right? So yes, I work for Citrix, but VMware, those guys are always doing some cool stuff too. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is, these, all the security vulnerabilities. I think, 2018 was a rough year for in the security world. So it started with Meltdown Inspector, right, kind of early January and continued into March, and a bunch of patches were reissued and reissued. But then mid-year, other stuff started to surface like Foreshadow. And some of these, in terms of performance, like Meltdown and Bypass in particular, they're not huge. Like they weren't a huge performance hit. But other ones like Spectre Variant 2 and L1 terminal fault, for example, they have shown to be quite the performance hogs, the mitigations, that is. And so, I've seen different studies out there, everything from 30% to 50%, and it's significant. I'm saying that for sure. But VMware was showing in this one of their white papers here that the default, I wanted to say, with L1 terminal fault was like 30%, 31%, and I think they showed with this new scheduler. So this is a new version, 6.7 update 2. They basically tweaked their scheduler to make it more efficient around L1 terminal fault, and they basically, I think, were able to slash off something like 15%. So it's something that you might want to take a look at if you're a VMware shop, at least on the hypervisor side. And I think the other thing too you're seeing here is all the hypervisor guys are doing this. They're starting to do this, Citrix, Microsoft, et cetera. But also Intel is starting to put some of these mitigations in the hardware. So that's going to change the game, I think, over the next year. All right, so kind of switching gears to cloud. And again, so I get these questions now. Now the more popular question, as opposed to like how many users can I get on a box, is what should I do in the cloud, or what instance type is best, for Citrix workloads in the cloud, like Azure. And so let me talk Azure here specifically for a minute. But we've done other tests, by the way, on AWS and GCP, and it's kind of the same as what we're finding is we used to recommend scaling out. So in the Azure world, that was like the D series and using the smaller D2 V2s. That was like a 2 vCPU, 7 gig of RAM spec. And so we basically recommended using those D series, those smaller Ds, and scaling out with a large number of them. Well, that was a few years ago. Fast forward to today, we reran the same testing, and we looked at the new D series. So these are the DV3s, and then we looked at the Fs. And I really wanted to look at the Fs because, according to Microsoft, these are the compute optimized series. So, and understanding and knowing that, CPUs are bottleneck in like the VDI world most of the times, I thought F would be the winner. And sure enough, F is starting to win out. And so it's not just about performance, but it's about cost too in the cloud world. And I'll show you some graphs here in a minute. But these bigger F instances, like the F8s and the F16s, they were winning. Not only again in performance, with kind of density, but then when you stack it against the cost models, like, Azure's latest pricing, they were winning out versus like the D V3s, for example, or even smaller Fs. So anyways, this stuff changes all the time, the pricing, the cost. So like you really, and honestly, by data center, by region, by cloud provider, it changes all the time, but we just reran it this week and I'll show you the kind of the latest results. Anyways, this best practice has changed significantly, as I mentioned. So we used to say scale out in the cloud, now we're saying scale up, just like on-prem, sort of that go big or go home. So here's the performance first, and then I'll show you the cost overlaid in a second. But again, we used login VSI here. And this was about 6 months ago we did this particular test. But you can see there on the bottom, these are various Fs and Ds. These are the latest Ds again, the V3 instances. And then the blue and the orange here is task worker and knowledge worker. So these are the kind of the profiles in the login VSI world. And they roughly map to XenApp and XenDesktop or SBC and VDI, right? The task worker, knowledge worker. So anyways, you can kind of see the VSI max numbers there. That's the density. And then when you take this and you use like the latest Azure East 2, let's say, pricing, then it becomes really interesting. And so the lower is better on this chart. And so that you see right away that F16 standard, that V2, and this is basically a 16 vCPU, 32 gig of RAM spec, that's winning out. That's best. And so you can see the other ones are close, so like the F4 is close, and even the D is close, but this F16 one is winning. It's cheaper, and again, it has the added benefit of you're going to have less VMs or instances to manage. So I think it's kind of a win-win to scale up in the cloud. The next question we get, and now when you kind of, maybe you have the performance kind of figured out, but the next question we get is, all right, so do we go like kind of pay as you go, or should we do reservations, and do like a 3-year kind of, reserved instances in the Azure world? And so this is the graph we showed about 6 months ago. And basically we're looking at that F16 instance in particular that was winning out. And this is with Azure East, I want to say 2 pricing. And we basically were looking at where the intersection is or where the sweet spot is. So this is pay as you go is the blue line. And then we have 2 kind of flat lines there, which are 1 and 3 year, reservations or reserved instances. And so as you can see there, we kind of determined that, the uptime, the sweet spot there is right around, 17, 18 hours. So we're saying that if you're up, if you can't effectively drain off, users off your hosts, then you probably should just, go reserved instances, go with the 3-year reserved and just leave them on. There's really no benefit going pay as you go unless you're able to do that and have, a lot less uptime. So that's really interesting. But then, we looked at it just this week. So this is literally this week, latest and greatest pricing. And we also did another thing because we're starting to see a lot of Azure hybrid benefit or hub, hybrid use benefit. But and this allows you to basically take, if you're unfamiliar with hub or hybrid benefit, allows you to take or use your existing kind of on-prem Windows Server licenses and kind of convert them into Azure. And you get some cost savings there. I think Microsoft touts 40% on their website. But anyways, when you look at the latest cost models here, again, this is the F16, this is US East. And then we kind of did the same thing with 1 and 3 year. And then we looked at like the kind of the base configuration with hybrid rights and then like a 1 and 3 year. And so the hybrid rights, this really changes the game. So the intersection, I'm not sure you can see there on the bottom, but if you go like 3-year reserved, and you're leveraging hybrid rights, now it's around 8 or 9 hours. So now it's almost a no-brainer, in this case, to go reserved and just leave your workloads on in Azure is what this means. And again, I get it. People are going to say, well, we can't leverage Azure hybrid benefit for all of our servers or all of our licenses. All right, well maybe it's half. And then again, that's the analysis you got to do. But let's say it's 50%. So what I'm saying is the new sweet spot. It might be between 8.5 hours and 18 hours. So maybe it's 13 is the sweet spot. So you got to kind of do that, based on your situation, right, with Microsoft licensing and all that. But I'm just saying that this definitely is not something to overlook. Hub is something to take into consideration for sure. But it's definitely worth doing this, by the way, the pay-as-you-go. And we kind of recommend doing pay-as-you-go to start. And maybe you start with some cheaper instances too, right? You don't go to the F or the D right away. You start with some of the cheaper instances, you go with pay-as-you-go, and then you figure out kind of, you kind of, you get your bearings there and you figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work in the cloud. And then, once you've got it dialed in, then you go 3-year reserved and you go F, big F. So that's kind of, I think, what we're, what some of the early customers that we're engaged with are doing. All right, and so that's, I think, what I just said here is basically Hub can change the game. So now the new sweet spot could be somewhere like 9 hours. I was saying with the 3-year reservations, but in reality, I bet you it's somewhere between 9 and 18. That's probably going to be the sweet spot based on how many of those on-prem licenses you really can or are willing to convert, and how many are covered by SA and all the stuff that has to apply for you to use that Azure hybrid benefit. But yeah, it's probably somewhere in between there now. All right, so I've talked a ton about single server scalability and the kind of back-end performance. I do want to I want to switch gears a little bit for the last one or two. There's a 1A and a 1B here. See, I told you there's more than 10. The title didn't lie. So I want to talk about login times first here, because this is definitely one of the questions I get a lot is like, what is a good logon time? Is it a minute? Is it 20 seconds? Can I get down to 6 seconds? Like some of these articles, like James, I want to say James Rankin said there, right? One of our CTPs. Can I really get like 5.2 or 6.2 seconds? So I'll again at the end I'll tell you what is a good, I think, login time and what's a good threshold, how to check your work. But I definitely think when I hear of long login times, and I trust me, I've seen everything. I've seen horror stories of an hour, or 8 minutes. Like I've seen crazy stuff there. But 9 times out of 10, it's I look at the profile design first, and what's exactly inside, how they've configured the profile, what's inside some of the shell folders, right? Some of the popular stuff like app data, what they're doing there. Are they doing exclusions, folder redirection, all that stuff? So that's a big culprit, and especially if you're roaming that stuff in and out every time, that's a big culprit of long login times. But there's other stuff. I get that. I mean, there's GPOs, there's login scripts, there's a bunch of different things to look at. And one of the things that comes in handy there when you're talking about group policy objects and login scripts is WEM. So our Citrix WEM, this is a tool that you can kind of add to your tool belt that basically takes those GPOs and login scripts and instead of processing them like in sequence or serially, now we can process those parallel. So we kind of effectively take that out of the login time. We do it all in the background for you, and we basically present you the shell or the kind of give you that user experience in your face sooner. And so WEM's something that we're seeing a lot of customers have some good success with. I'm not saying it's going to cut your login times in half, like maybe some of the marketing materials say, right? Like, oh, you can go from a minute to 30 seconds. Yeah, maybe if your GPOs and login scripts are a mess. But other times, let's say your GPOs and login scripts are in decent shape, it could shave off 5 seconds. And every second counts, trust me, especially when there's a doctor waiting for a login, right? Every single second's critical. Another thing I wanted to highlight here is FS Logics, right? So I think it was about a month and a half ago, Microsoft basically made the announcement that, any customers that have, active kind of RDSH or paying Microsoft licenses, which applies to a lot of customers. So if you have Citrix licenses, you probably get this for free, right? Because you're paying for those RDS CALs. Or same with VDI, by the way. That now FS Logics is basically available to you. And FS Logics has some really cool stuff. And so they have this like profile container, and like a lot of these things, it's a VHD mounting technology. But now again, it just allows you to present that shell to a user quicker, faster, so they can have the appearance of logging in. And basically, we're going to do things offline or over the network to that VHD container, that profile container. So another tool that we're seeing, and we've been even before FS Logics was sort of announced as free. A month ago, we've had customers use FS Logics and do this for the last couple of years. So it definitely can shave a few more seconds off. And then the last thing here is I have a couple screenshots that you might not be able to see very well, but I wanted to say that the latest versions of like Citrix Director, it has some cool kind of features to dig into the, some of these log-on time killers, right? So I put like interactive session. So a lot of people are like, what is interactive session? So it's these three things right there, the pre-usernet, usernet, and shell. It kind of breaks down each of those, which is cool because it allows you to kind of peer inside of this, kind of gray area of interactive session. But also profiles and group policies. So I didn't show, but profile load, you can kind of see there. It says like how many files are inside the profile. It'll show you which folders, right? Which shell folders are actually consuming the most, like app data, for example, and the size of the profile. So some cool stuff that you can use to your advantage to find out, what is bloating your profile. And maybe it's the cause of your long login times, right? That are, 8 minutes. All right, and then 1B. So let's assume, your servers, you carve those up properly, you optimized them, they're sized perfectly, all that stuff, right? That, you followed all the best practices that I've kind of laid out here. And let's say your login time's fast, right? Let's say it's 20 seconds and you're happy with that. Like, what else is there? Well, now, you got to switch gears and look at the in-session, right? User experience or performance. So I'm a big believer in these new generation of remoting protocols, and really the ones that we're leveraging UDP now. So, we've 20 years ago, right? And it's like bandwidth was, we didn't have a lot of it, let's just say. And so we literally, like the first virtual channel inside Citrix ICA was dubbed thin wire, and it still is in the code, thin wire. But basically we wanted to make it, thin on the wire or on the network. That was the whole idea, because we didn't have a lot of bandwidth. And we were trying to cram in 10 users, let's say, on a 36K modem. And so that was then, but today, bandwidth is a lot more available, and it's cheaper, all those things. So you've seen some of the new remoting protocols, really over the last 3 to 5 years, kind of changed things up. And, Citrix has kind of followed suit here. And the first thing we started doing was we would let you run, specific virtual channels. We'd actually change them to UDP, and we'd leave the rest as TCP. But now with Citrix EDT, this is our enlightened data transport. It's basically UDP out of the gates for everything. And so this is, and similar, like with PC over IP, they've been doing this for years. Also, VMware followed suit with Blast Extreme. It's predominantly UDP based. We're basically saturating the pipe. So we're trying to, instead of making it thin like we were before, now we're trying to actually, push as much as we can through there. And what this does is improve the interactivity. And we've done a ton of tests showing this. It just means this, the screen scrapes, right? Everything's more interactive and responsive, up to, it can be almost double. And anytime you have an improved frame rate, frames per second, it's going to mean that the user can probably do more with less, see better, all that stuff. And it just translates to a better user experience. So anyways, I'm a big believer in these kind of new gen, remoting protocols. The other thing that, you've seen over the last, again, 3 to 5 years, I'd say in particular, is they're all adaptive. And we've had this kind of adaptive technology forever, but we have this kind of adaptive, transport kind of 2.0, I'd call it, in the last year and a year and a half in the Citrix world. But now it allows us to do things like alter the encoding mechanism, right? From like H.264 to like JPEG on the fly. Or we can actually alter the compression algorithm on the fly. And depending on like what we pick up on the screen, is it like a text versus a picture? We can apply different compression algorithms or things like that, where it's like lossy versus lossless. And the other cool thing about all these protocols is they have the ability to kind of switch or fall back from UDP to TCP. Like let's say with Citrix EDT, let's say you don't have the port open or something, or you don't meet, you have a client that doesn't support the EDT or UDP. Right away, straight away out of the gates, we can fall back, TCP intelligently. So anyways, if you haven't checked out, EDT or, some of these latest protocols, definitely encourage you to check them out. We made EDT the default thing now right after the LTSR shipped. So in 7.16, I believe, was the specific release where we actually made it the default. But anyways, that's kind of gonna be the future, and it shows you kind of what the future holds there, I think. And then the other thing too is, we have like every vendor, Citrix, VMware, I know they have the same, like these policy templates to optimize, the user experience. And you can do different things. Like we have like 5 or 6 of them. So if you really want to, optimize for security, you can do that. But if you want to optimize for like the, very high definition user experience, right, we can do that. Or if you want to optimize for the LAN versus the WAN, you can do that. And so we have like Citrix, there's 100 different policies these templates are awesome because they basically provide you with a little, all the recommended settings, for what that's trying to do there, like optimize it for a, a WAN or a remote connection. So we kind of take a lot of that guesswork and all the stuff we had to do manually. I feel like, back in the day, it's kind of done right. It's done for you. So check those out if you haven't seen those, but I'm sure most people have. So at this point, you're probably saying, yeah, all this stuff sounds great. I'm willing to follow these 12 or 13, kind of best practices, but, how do I check my work? Or like, what should I expect with density? Or what should I expect with a login time? Like what's adequate? What's good? So first there on the density side, again, this how many users can I get on a box or how many VMs can I get on a box? So that's kind of the, SBC versus VDI there. I came up with this thing called the rule of 5 and 10. And again, it's kind of based on CPU because that's the bottleneck. But really what you do is if you have a 2x14 there, so that's 28 physical cores. I'm saying for XenApp or SBC or RDSH-based workloads, just multiply it by 10. And that number there is what you can expect in terms of users per box or density. So in this case, 280 users per box. Of course, this is based on a medium-ish workload, right? And you can debate all day like what that means, but you'd be surprised how close this is, that 10. I was just showing about a month ago, I took 12 real-world examples. And so these are real world. So, the different workloads, different hypervisors, different Citrix versions, some had applied, security mitigations for Spectre, some hadn't, for L1 terminal fault, et cetera, like very, real world, 12 of them. I averaged them all together and the magic number was 9.2. So, maybe it's a little bit under that these days, with some of the security stuff. But it's really, really close. And this is a great little thing that you can do in 1 minute to figure out your density, as opposed to maybe, taking a few weeks, right, and running it through the paces with a real tool like Login VSI. And then same with VDI, the magic number there, 5. I think that's a good one to use. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6 again, but if you just take 5 and multiply it by the number of physical cores, that's a good kind of guesstimate in terms of how many VDIs, per host you can expect. So anyways, if you want to hear more about this and where like the 5 and the 10 came from and what some of the other factors are that impact single server scalability, check out the last article there on TechZone. So if you just Google single server scalability, Citrix TechZone, it should pop right up, but that's one I wrote here recently. And I mentioned login times, I always, get this question, what's good, what's bad, what's terrible, what's acceptable, right? And I kind of coined this the rule of 30. And it's funny because I think when I published this, I think the folks at ControlUp reached out and they were like, wow, that's really interesting. We just looked at all of our data from all the logins, over the last, whatever it was, year. It's from, hundreds of thousands of users of logins. And the average they found was like 29.4 seconds, I believe. So it was amazing that it was like right at 30. But this was just based on my, experience, working with, probably a couple hundred customers in the Fortune 500 and, other places over the last 15 years that, generally I'd say, if you have 20, 25 seconds, pretty good, especially in enterprise where there's a lot of stuff out of your control, to be quite honest, like group policies, for example, or legacy login scripts you have to run for whatever reason. But generally, if you're over 30, if you're 40 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, 8 minutes, if you have to get a cup of coffee to wait to log in, there's probably something, up there. And that's where I would investigate and look at the profiles and look at your group policies and see if things like, WEM can help there. And yeah, anyway, so as I mentioned, Director, ControlUp, EG, Lakeside, there's a bunch of tools out there that can really help these days and drill into the login process. But yeah, you should definitely not just kind of trust, that your 8-minute login time is acceptable. The last couple articles right there from a couple of our CTPs, I think I already mentioned the James Rankin one, but the JG Spears one as well. It kind of helps you dig into that, some people ask like, well, why is Director showing this amount and in the real world it's this, and those don't add up, or why is interactive session, saying this? That last one's really good at kind of demystifying that. But I think those are 2 really good practical articles that you can follow to help you kind of shave some seconds off your login time. And then the last thing too is storage, right? So I think it was, probably 8-7 years ago, storage, IOPS, that was like the hot word. And a lot of times when we did VDI deployments, storage and IOPS, that was the bottleneck. Well, these days we have lots of different technology to handle this. And really, I don't see it being a bottleneck. But one of the things, obviously being, again, it's kind of from Citrix, a lot of our deployments use PVS still. I'd say a good 80% or so in the enterprise space. And so one of the things I tell customers to look at is make sure you look at this cache copy read hits percentage, because that's the most important counter when it comes to PVS. Because if this is near 100%, which it should be in the steady state, that means you're serving basically the target devices in the PVS world from system cache, which is a special place in the kernel memory. And that means it's going to be fast, performance is going to be good, storage is not going to be a bottleneck. If you see this number below, 60%, or it's spiky in a steady state, that's bad. That means you're probably, serving up target devices from disk, which is super, super slow compared to memory or system cache. So that's what I'm kind of talking about there. And with that, I think I have a minute, so perfect timing. I'll just run through the key takeaways. I know we probably won't have time for questions, but just to kind of wrap things up, that rule of 5 and 10, I think it's still a great way to kind of get a quick, triple S estimate. If you want to know your true scalability numbers, great. We have Login VSI, right? So we have a tool where you can get your exact magic number, right? Whether it's 9.2 or it's 12 or 5. Mind those ad agents and ads. I still see so many people. I think we have a better grasp of the agents these days, but I still see ads like with browsers, just crushing performance. What else here? Tech Zone is if there's a page to bookmark here to stay on top of this stuff and some of these latest best practices, the Citrix Tech Zone, which we kind of launched just a few months ago at Summit. It's a great one that's where a lot of our CCS folks are publishing things these days. And other than that, tune, test, and test some more. And if I didn't mention it before, there's this awesome company named Login VSI, and they make some products that help. They help you do some scalability testing and things like Login PI also, that we've used now in the field as well. They help you kind of get a better handle on user experience too. So, all right, I think my time is up. Perfect. I don't have time for questions. I was going to say, Blair, but.
Yep, that's okay. We had 5 or 6 questions out there. I'll make sure you get those so you can get them to the folks that have definitely taken the time to ask. Great stuff as always, Nick. You as listeners out there in the audience, take his advice. Guaranteed will save you time and money. Nick, thanks to you and Citrix for sponsoring this event. And for those of you that are still participants with us, we have now about a 30-minute break for lunch. Please visit the vendor expos. Get those raffles. There's really cool stuff that is being given away. And then we'll pick back up here in, like I said, 30 minutes with a couple more vendor presentations, and then another great couple of technical sessions for you. So we'll look forward to catching you then. Nick, thanks a lot, man. Have a good one.
Thanks so much. Yep. Appreciate you guys having me. That was fun. Thanks a lot.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.